Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for being here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat while we wait for others to join. So we have partnered with the Los Angeles Worker Center Network to host a discussion on the role of worker centers in workforce development and to talk about how worker centers are advancing equity and job quality in low-wage industries. My name is Ana Luz Gonzalez Vasquez, and I'm a project manager at the UCLA Labor Center. With me today are Najiba Saeed, she's the director of the Los Angeles Worker Center Network, Magali Lopez, she's a senior research analyst at the UCLA Labor Center, and Kevin Lee, who's a PhD candidate at MIT and also a research assistant at the UCLA Labor Center. And we have two wonderful guests with us today, Janelle Bailey, who is the co-executive director of the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, and Claude Rodriguez, who's the executive director of the Clean Car Wash Worker Center. And our webinar is divided into 4 parts. During the first part, we'll be providing some context and presenting our research findings. And in the longer second half, you will learn from worker centers. These are community-based organizations that are built by workers for workers about what workforce development looks like when it's driven by marginalized communities, how they approach skills building, leadership development, and employer engagement, and how they apply labor enforcement, organizing, and advocacy mechanisms to improve the quality of work and raise industry standards. I will hand over the mic now to our co-host, who will welcome you and share more about our work.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm Najiba Saeed with the LA Worker Center Network, and we are delighted the UCLA Labor Center and many UCLA students and faculty are really a part of the family of the LA Worker Center Network. And our mission as a center, sort of a coalition of centers, is to raise the visibility of and support organizing by low-wage workers, particularly immigrant and refugee workers and workers of color in Los Angeles. And I think one thing to keep in mind with our mission is we see and we feel as a coalition that, in fact, many of the workers that are our members are highly skilled workers. So we often talk about not equating or utilizing terminology for low-wage workers to equal low-skill workers. In fact, many of our workers have 20, 30 years experience and can do the kind of work with a specialty and specialization. So I just wanted to point that out. It's really important that we pay attention to language. So we're really delighted. Over the years, we've had different sets of members. This is our current membership. Many of you may know about the history of the LA Worker Center Network as the End Wage Theft Coalition that was really successful in helping to establish the Office of Wage Standards in the city of Los Angeles, an ordinance, and also state as well as county based enforcement for wage theft. So we have now in this iteration, our members consist of Clean Car Wash Campaign, the Garment Worker Center, Koreatown Immigrant Worker Center, Kiwa, the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, Filipino Worker Center, Restaurant Opportunity Center of Los Angeles, UCLA Downtown Labor Center, and the Warehouse Worker Center. And one of the things I drew on here was the research from Janice Fine. If you're not familiar with her work, I would really encourage you to look at it, who early on helped us to understand the range of activities around what worker centers do. So we have this kind of approach in 3 ways. And all of our centers, what's really exciting about our centers is that they're so unique and contextualized. So as you can see, some of them are focused on industries, some of them are focused on communities, but that means they're able to go in with great depth into whether it's a geographic area, an industry area, or work with particular communities. So service delivery has been a really integral part of worker centers. Many of you may have been familiar with the day labor movement, which really informs the work of current worker centers. And there are still many day labor centers that are functioning and functional and serve communities. So service delivery includes legal representation to recover unpaid wages, English classes, workers' rights education, and access to health clinics, loans, financial literacy. And during the pandemic, it was really worker centers that rose to the occasion around mutual aid. So many of our centers, I was thinking about my office at the Filipino Worker Center, it was full of, every worker center that I visited is full of PPE equipment, really these became not just distribution centers, but ways to reach workers who are undocumented, workers who may be afraid to receive some services from government entities. So I think that's really important. The front line during the pandemic raised the visibility, but also the reality that many service delivery systems did not reach those that needed it most. Kiwa, one of our organizations, does key organizing in Koreatown grocery stores. And some of these stores experience up to 50% COVID infection rates. And it was organizations like Kiwa that were able to really get to these communities. And I think the philanthropic, as well as other agencies, have recognized that. And advocacy is also really important. Researching and exposing and talking about how these industries need better practices. The Garment Worker Center has really been the lead on partnering, for instance, with industry leaders to be able to move the needle on practices. And now they are working on national legislation to be able to replicate an industry standard for the garment workers who are members, but also now at the national level, lobbying for new laws, changes in existing ones, working with government agencies to improve monitoring and grieving processes, and bringing suits against employers. So another function of many of our worker centers is to fill in the gap for enforcement, because again, these are often workers that may have language barriers, economic barriers, transportation barriers. So organizations in our network are really key to that. The Car Wash Worker Centers has really been leading, and you'll be hearing from them later, in workforce development and also in advocacy for workers in that industry, in fact, transforming the industry in many ways. And last but not least is organizing. And this includes building ongoing organizations, engaging in leadership development, so that the goal ultimately is that worker centers focus on the capacity of workers to improve their lives in many ways by recognizing their own agency. So the Black Worker Center, which we'll hear about as well, part of the national Black worker movement. If you talk to many of the members that come through the center, by the time they've gone through the programs, they have taken on a sense of agency and understanding for the economic conditions of their industry. And the goal is really that they take action on their own behalf. These are not just centers that give out services, but the goal is to organize individually, to organize at the community level, and some of the exciting edges of our work with the growth in the warehouses here in Southern California, organizations like the Warehouse Worker Center, all the way to the Inland Empire, are moving the ability and the capacity for warehouse workers who are in what we now know to be very dangerous conditions, and working with members to really self-organize individually as a group and across industries to change conditions for workers in low-wage industries. And these are key and vital industries for Southern California, whether it's the hospitality industry, whether it's the restaurant industry, like the Restaurant Opportunity Center here in Southern California that lead in that area. We're so delighted to be a part of this conversation because ultimately workforce development, reaching workers who can transform themselves and their communities and work with industry leaders is really the goal for all of us. It improves our lives collectively. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Najiba. And for those that are not familiar with our work, the UCLA Labor Center is a unit of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. And we have a 50-year track record of research, education, policy work, and leadership development that promotes higher industry standards, creates jobs that are good for communities, and strengthens racial equity and immigrant rights. And I'm so proud to introduce to you one of our newest areas of work at the Labor Center, Prosperity, Opportunity, and Worker Equity Reimagined, or POWER in Workforce Development. And while our team is quite small, we do have over 2 decades of experience researching low-wage work and worker centers. We focus on applied research, evaluation, and alliance building. We're lifting up non-traditional workforce development practices and organizations that serve the most marginalized communities in our state. We're also creating a workforce development program evaluation framework that is culturally responsive and conducted through a racial equity lens. And we gather a network of experts to guide efforts to enhance equity and job quality in California's public workforce development system in collaboration with state labor agency leaders. And before I share more about the study that we conducted, I'll begin with some context. Historically, workforce development systems have not been able to prioritize low-wage industries with the highest concentration of BIPOC workers, even though low-wage workers make up a significant portion of the workforce. In fact, in California, 1 in 3 workers are low-wage workers, 3 in 4 are workers of color, and 40% are immigrants. And when compared to the total California workforce, low-wage workers are twice as likely to work part-time. They're less likely to be members of a union. They're less likely to receive employment-provided health insurance and retirement benefits. And they're also more likely to live in households with incomes below the poverty line. But what's exciting about current times is that the conversations on workforce development are evolving to more intentionally center worker voice, equity, and job quality. And these are priorities that have long been the focus of worker centers and movements for racial equity and economic justice more generally. And given that the state's focus on equity and job quality is really timely, we saw an opportunity to lift up the work that worker centers do. If we're going to address equity and job quality in workforce development system, we have to start with low-wage work. Can we go on to the next slide? As Najiba mentioned, worker centers are built by and for workers of color that have historically been left out of the workforce development system. And they've existed since the 1920s, but they really exploded in growth nationwide in the early 2000s to support and address the needs of low-wage workers and immigrants by changing industry standards. And what's important to know about worker centers is that they exist in many parts of the workforce that are not unionized and among immigrant populations that have not had the opportunity to join unions. And as Najiba mentioned, each worker center may look different from the next as each serves different populations, operates in different industries, engages in different activities, and even adopts different approaches to addressing systemic issues that prevent communities of color from thriving. But they all do very important work at the forefront of racial and economic justice. And they're not taking new leadership, redefining workforce development. And while we know quite a bit about worker centers' engagement and community organizing and policy advocacy, their role in workforce development still remains poorly understood. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I'll close my presentation by sharing images that really illustrate how we began working with worker centers. I started working with worker centers as a graduate student in 2002. I spent over 4 years talking to workers to capture their experiences as day laborers and to document how worker centers were addressing the needs of day laborers in their communities. And in the early 2000s, worker centers shared that day laborers are being harassed by anti-immigrant organizations, local businesses, and police. And what you see on the left-hand side here is an image of workers being asked by police to congregate between those yellow posts. And that was the solution that Home Depot developed to address issues of day labor. On the right-hand side, you see a totally different approach. These are worker centers, educating workers on their rights, also sharing information about other services like English as a second language courses. And on the bottom right-hand side, you'll see me conducting interviews with worker centers for a study that I worked on, the National Day Labor Study. And what we were able to find with our research is that 1 in 2 day laborers experienced at least one instance of wage theft 2 months prior to being surveyed. Almost 1 in 2 were denied water and rest breaks. 3 in 4 stated that their work was dangerous, and 1 in 5 had suffered an injury while on the job. And what was important about our study is that it provided not only a portrait of day laborers in the US, but it also highlighted the important work that worker centers do to lift industry standards and protect workers from unscrupulous employers. And now I'll hand it over to Magali so that she can share more about our study.
Thank you, Ana Luz, and thank you all so much for being here. This project is really special to us. As you saw, Ana Luz has been involved with this work since the early 2000s. And actually, my first research project included analyzing a set of interviews that Ana Luz had conducted during the National Day Labor Study. So we're happy that, our specialization that we developed back then is now, coming full circle with our specialization on workforce development now. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit on the research study that we conducted. In early 2020, Ana Luz, Kevin, and I started a study as part of the initial effort to just better understand alignment between worker centers and workforce development. We started by conducting a scan of worker centers throughout California. We collected baseline information about the populations that they serve, the industries they work with, and other relevant information to just help us understand the landscape. This initial search really helped us update the universe of worker centers, and it helped us to move on to the next phase of our work, which was the interviews. We interviewed 12 of the 35 worker centers that we identified in California. And we're thankful that we were able to leverage our relationships with worker centers to gain access to staff during a time when there was very limited capacity and significant transitions into virtual living happening. It was at the very onset of COVID. So thank you all in the room that participated in those interviews with us and made yourselves available. We took this data, we analyzed it, and we decided to release the research findings as a public-facing brief that we think for the first time intentionally documents the worker center approach to workforce development. As Ana Luz said, the work that worker centers do with regard to workforce development is poorly understood. And so this brief is an attempt to really demonstrate what that looks like. So if you look at the screen, you'll see a QR code. So if you want to access the study now, just point your camera toward the QR code and it'll take you directly to the link. Okay. All right, so when you take a look at the brief, you'll see that it focuses mostly on the work that worker centers do and how it works toward the same goals that the workforce development field is prioritizing, like providing training opportunities to underserved communities, improving industry standards, and so on. We know the workforce development system doesn't always reach the folks that can most use their resources. So in this brief, we attempt to lift up the value of the worker center approach as we work toward creating opportunities for economic prosperity for everyone in California. We think that through this study, we were able to make two important contributions. First, we think we provide an updated universe of the worker centers through the pretty map that Ana Luz shared, and that's in our backgrounds. And I'll just say one thing about that. You'll see other studies that may show a different count of worker centers, and it's not that, most of them show higher numbers of worker centers. It's not that the number of worker centers is declining in California. It's that in this study, because we wanted to focus on, the worker-centered aspect of worker centers, in our definition of worker centers, we included the worker centers that were created by and for workers. There's other organizations that do very similar work, but those were not included in our count. So that's the difference that you'll see. So aside from just an updated count, we also think that another contribution is that we capture the intersection between worker centers and workforce development by describing how worker centers' efforts are relevant to a more comprehensive approach to workforce development that we're all dreaming up. And it's one that reaches the communities in most need and that looks beyond placements as a solution for economic opportunity. So I'll just share a couple of high-level findings, 3 actually. So through this study, we found that centers show that it is possible to reach low-wage workers and industries that workforce development providers often cannot reach. We also know that the departments within the labor agency tend to work in silos, and worker centers are demonstrating that working at the intersection of workforce development and labor standards enforcement can create new opportunities to transform low-wage work and workers in those industries. And finally, traditionally, in workforce development, we don't typically see organizing and policy advocacy as important components of workforce development efforts. But worker centers are modeling how community organizing and policy advocacy are important tools that are needed to change the very fabric of the workforce system, as well as other adjacent systems that contribute to inequality. So with these high levels in mind, we'll now turn the conversation over to a couple of our worker center partners. They're going to speak more about what the intersection of the worker center approach to their work, about the worker center approach to their work, and what a comprehensive approach to workforce development looks like on the ground. So I'll turn the mic over to Kevin Lee, who's the third key contributor to this work. He will be moderating the conversation.
Flor is a workers' rights advocate who brings over 12 years of experience in coalition building, organizing, leadership development, and so much more to CLEAN. And she first joined CLEAN as a community organizer back in 2012, 10 years ago, wow. And as an executive director, she led its transition from a community union campaign into a fully fledged independent worker center. Janelle Bailey is also with us today, and she is the Los Angeles Black Worker Center's co-executive director of organizing and programs. Born and raised in Chicago, Janelle is a campaigner who has devoted time to organizing to improve the lives of working people. Before joining the LA Black Worker Center, Janelle worked most recently with the Service Employees International Union in the Midwest and the Worker Center for Racial Justice in Chicago. We'll start off with a question for Flor. So there is a lot of dialogue around worker-centered approaches to workforce development. And being worker and community-centered is so obviously one of the most central, most powerful aspects of your work at CLEAN, but also in worker centers more generally. And so our question is, what does being community and worker-centered look like at CLEAN?
Yes, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So happy to see so many familiar faces. Sad it's over this little box of Zoom again, but happy nevertheless to continue doing this work. Kevin, to answer to your question, I really think that something that is very unique about worker centers is our approach to how we connect to workers. You know, I think when workers come into our doors, they might be coming because they had an issue at work, or usually it pertains to wage theft, right, in a low-wage industry. And I think the approach that worker centers have always had and continue to have, and that's what grants the success of the work that we do, is we meet workers where they're at. I think a worker might come in because, you know, maybe something happened where they didn't get paid, or they're having issues accessing their wages. But I think once that conversation and involvement happens, as a worker center, we get to have a very holistic approach of getting to know the worker and those needs, right? At that moment, it might be the wages, but meeting the worker where they're at and addressing those very exclusive necessities allow us to open the door to really getting to know the worker, the community this worker is in, and then also making them feel a part of a bigger fight, right? One of the questions or one of the responses that Magali was sharing was how we are, as worker centers, modeling getting the workers together, addressing what the issues are as the different worker centers involved, and really working towards those issues in a more systematic way, doing it together. And I think that is something that is very unique about worker centers, putting the workers' needs first and then really guiding with that in our organizing and in our work.
Thank you so much, Flor, for sharing all of that wonderful, wonderful information. So turning to you now, Janelle, some folks think that worker centers have no relationships or only contentious relationships with employers. But especially at the Black Worker Center, workforce development has been such a key aspect of your work for quite a while now. And you work with employers in a range of different industries, from construction to the public sector. And employers benefit from being able to look for workers from LA Black Worker Center. Can you briefly describe the characteristics of the various industries that you work in and how you engage with the employers in each of them?
Sure. Again, hello. I'm just looking at the chat to see this is such a star-studded event. So thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. But yeah, to get to your question about, the various industries we engage in, our organization, the LA Black Worker Center, was founded to address the Black jobs crisis, which is specifically referring to the historical exclusion of Black workers from, the workforce, formally. And, that happens generally through a legacy of policies that set up a culture of exclusion. And those policies are like, slavery, Jim Crow, Black codes, Prop 209, And so, just to give background as to how, we're coming to engage, but we engage in a number of industries, and our organization came to be known through our campaign work specifically for construction and in the public sector. And that's specifically because those industries were historically key to Black folks' movement into the so-called middle class. So, really being able to hold down an income that, stabilizes and really just lifts up the family, whether that is, the nuclear family on four walls or the family as we actually experience it. And so the trades, they do have, a reputation, a history for historically being exclusive, but they have defined some key tools that if you're using them with the right values could really be used to lift workers up. And so those are tools like the apprenticeship and project labor agreement. And so in partnership with labor, we've been able to engage, employers in the construction industry. And then with the public sector, which again has been historically Black, and that's going back to like the 1800s. So like after emancipation, it was largely Black workers who delivered the mail, which you see the U.S. Postal Service today remains, pretty Black. But, through partnering with allies and doing research, we found that Black folks were generally able to earn more than 40% more in the public sector than private. And that has a lot to do with the high rate of unionization in the public sector and the accountability around, how employment works there. And so, we've been able to engage with employers, particularly, city of LA, the state of California, to move things forward for Black workers over here.
Thank you so much, Janelle. And now transitioning into another question on the ways in which you all are systems oriented in your approach to your work. So maybe Janelle, transitioning from what you just said, could you share an example of a coalition that the LA Black Worker Center has been a part of, and any sort of systemic improvements that you've achieved through that work? You addressed it a little bit with the project labor management, project labor agreement work, et cetera, but could you say a little bit more about another coalition?
Oh yeah, coalition work is so important to us, partly because Black folks are less than 10% of the population here. So when we win, a lot of times it's because we're engaging with allies that are also directly impacted by the issues that we're raising up. And so I think a really good example is establishing the Civil and Human Rights Department. And that's the first time they had that in the city of LA. And we were only able to win that in coalition with a lot of the folks on this call. And so specifically folks at the Worker Center Network, the LA Federation of Labor, COCO Community Coalition, Alliance of Men and Boys of Color. So that that coalition piece is so important. And same with our public sector work right now. We're campaigning for 1,000 jobs for Black workers, in different parts of the public sector. And so that's required partnership with labor, like SEIU, AFSCME, again, the Fed, Worker Education Resource Center. So we have to, be in partnership with our allies to move things forward. The tide that lifts for Black workers is going to really lift for a lot of workers.
Absolutely. I love that. That's the essence of equity, focusing on the most marginalized, focusing on Black folks, on immigrants, and the tide rises for all. And Flor, could you share an example of a coalition that you'll have been a part of and any systemic changes that have emerged as a result as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think just like Janelle mentioned right now, like just coming together as all different worker centers in the LA Worker Center network has really put us together. And perfect examples of that was the raise of the minimum wage, also the wage enforcement agencies at our local level, right? And that is all of us coming together. I think perfect examples of our major wins the California Coalition for Worker Power, right? Really moving some in and I think another one for all that is really putting workers first and really guiding.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You're cutting out a little bit, Flo, but I think we caught most of what you're saying. And now we'll just transition into sort of our last question before we head into our discussion. So, I mean, we're currently in a very critical moment, as we all know, and as we slowly, hopefully, emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic and into a real post-pandemic economic recovery, hopefully one that centers equity and job quality, workforce development is really a key priority for the state. And so our question is, how can we ensure that workforce development dollars are indeed addressing the needs of our most marginalized workers, especially those in low wage industries? And maybe Flor, we can begin with you.
Yeah, does this sound okay? Am I coming in good now? Okay, great. I think if we are talking about reimagining what workforce development is, we cannot continue to exclude low wage workers. And I just need to say that again, right? Because we cannot continue to talk about reimagine workforce development with equity, job development, right? Job placement. We cannot continue to have those conversations excluding workers in low wage industries, right? These industries need to be pushed, workers need to be recognized, particularly now through the whole many years that this has been happening, and the pandemic has just like really shown how much more needed. We're considering a lot of workers as essential and as heroes, and now not excluding them, not including them in these conversations. I don't see how that can happen. So I wanted to start with that because I think that sets the foundation of where we need to go from there. I think something that we do very collectively and as worker centers is really address the leadership development, the workforce development with trainings that are created by experts, right? The workers themselves. Meeting workers where they're at. This is where I was going to with this. Workers who have, for example, in the car wash industry, right? Workers who have over 15 years of experience, putting a training curriculum from workers, for workers, to workers, really sharing the best practices. How do we not consider that, the workforce development, right? Really putting those into context. I think the approach that as workers we do is we provide those trainings in the time frame that really fits for our community. There might be ESL classes somewhere else, there might be other classes, but it doesn't fit the time and schedule and the language and the public education approach that worker centers bring to this work. So I think really these are the type of training opportunities that really create economic development for income mobility and income stability for workers. One perfect example I can share is like the training that we have done with our detail training that has now, over the years resulted in the first ever worker-owned cooperative in the car wash industry. Clean Wash Mobile LLC, the first worker mobile cooperative. Just last month we celebrated our first fleet vehicle contract with the St. John's Clinic. These are workers who are leading in the industry, are open to creating a different pathway. We know if the root of everything is going to be our organizing, but creating those pathways. And I think that is how we approach the systems change, how we start setting up those bars, but not only setting them high, but maintaining those high. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, for well said. Absolutely. Starting from the premise that workers are the experts and really carrying that through in the way that you cater to their times, cater to the services in a linguistically and culturally competent way, and transforming car detailing training programs into new opportunities for business development, cooperative development, and developing new kinds of economies that work for the most marginalized. Yes, yes, yes. And Janelle, would you like to share, what do you think about how workforce development dollars can be addressed, can be leveraged to address the needs of our most marginalized workers?
Oh yeah, I would definitely co-sign everything she just said. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it's sometimes challenging to talk about like post-pandemic recovery, because honestly, so many of us are still in the thick of it right now, especially people who, like don't have this privilege of working on Zoom, people who are, very present every day. A lot of folks around me are, bereaved. And like I said, it's very much impacted in this moment by the pandemic. But when we think about how those workforce dollars are spent, I mean, Flor said it, like you got to put the workers first. Low wage workers, immigrant workers, Black workers, we are not just recipients of services. We are leaders in our industries. And so that's where we got to get the information from. These same outcomes sometimes for workforce development, some folks seem puzzled by, oh, we trained all these folks, but then they didn't get placed. Like, no, we got to switch it up. We got to listen to the workers. While some folks, like I said, may be running into the same problems, workers themselves can very quickly identify barriers and very quickly identify, well, if we made this change here, this could move things forward. One example particular to the public sector is the civil service exam. That is a clearly identifiable barrier for a lot of folks, particularly if they're not, English is not their first language, particularly if they haven't been like coached or like schooled to take tests specifically. It's a barrier for a number of reasons for a lot of folks. And so, like I said, workers can quickly identify that. And so that is something that, folks are an example of something that workers are organizing around to, kind of ease the way to get more folks included in the workforce that provides services to everyone who stay here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Janelle. And thank you so much to the both of you, Janelle and Flor, for sharing space with us and for sharing so much of your brilliance and wisdom with us. I'd love to turn the mic over to Najiba to facilitate our discussion and so open the floor to everybody.
Thank you. I'm so excited. And I just wanted to start off with a couple things. One of them is that just recognizing that when we say low wage worker, to echo what Flor was saying, it's low wage worker, but high skilled workers. Like, I think we need to begin to put those together. Low wage workers does not mean low skilled workers. In fact, that is a policy issue because people are paid low wages, but are extremely adept at their jobs in the last 20 years. And so I think that's part of the discourse, is being able to put together those two concepts regularly and articulate why, for instance, lived experience is so important to policy making, that when you make a policy related to low wage workers, if they're not involved with the development of that policy, it's not just a moral issue, but it's also, yes, workers in low wage industries. There are many ways that we could think about this language. I just wanted to throw that out there as part of what our panelists have been addressing. And to think through the intersection, not just intersectionality, the intersection between workforce development, affordable housing, which Kiwa has been really involved with this year in recognizing with ACT LA, and the idea that worker centers are already doing this. This isn't new. They've been doing workforce development and they've been doing it in a model that really will, as our network moves forward, and our goal as a network is to impact and articulate and develop effective policies industry-wide, in multi-sectors, statewide, locally, and hopefully nationally, and get to the point where, as Filipino Worker Center and KIO, which were both part of organizing a mayoral debate, that you can't run for office in LA without answering a question about workers in low-wage industries, which I wanted to lastly just mention are actually the drivers of economics in Los Angeles. The garment worker center, the construction workers, these are industries that LA relies on. These are not peripheral peripheral industries. They're core to the cultural and economic vitality of Los Angeles. That's why having employers as part of this conversation is so important. So I'm going to start looking at the chat. I also wanted to introduce, we're building our staff. Armando Godinho joins us today. He can wave to you. He's our new policy director for the LA Worker Center Network. Because of Zoom, many of our executive committee haven't met him, but he joins us with 20 years of policymaking experience across different jurisdictions. And so we're really delighted to have him join us. So wonderful. I'm going to open it up. If you want to start dropping your questions right here in the chat, and we're happy to start taking them that way. So I was wondering, maybe, Luz, if you wanted to address what is resonating with you about the particular issue related to where do you think workforce development dollars are allocated in a way that is impacting the communities that you work with? And if not, do you have any ideas or suggestions for that? If you both want to address that, and then we'll open it up for questions. Oh, so I was asking either Janelle or Flora, if you wanted to talk about, if you were, let's say you were to advise someone on how to spend workforce development dollars, would you have any suggestions? What's working? What improvements would you make? So I wanted to open it up to our panelists. And then please, from the audience, if you have questions, just drop your questions in the chat.
Sorry, I was staring. I thought you were talking to Luz. I'm sorry. But as far as, where the dollar should particularly be going, again, I think it is about centering the workers and, worker organizations. Anywhere that workers are gathering a number is a great place to invest in, honestly, because that's where we're going to get the most direct and impactful solutions about what's going to be great for that industry and the folks that move it. So my answer, honestly, is so simple. It really is to just, invest in the workers. And I don't mean in the condescending way of, oh, we're going to upskill them, but I mean to truly engage and hear more about what their needs are and where they see fit to, again, put those dollars and remove barriers for entry and advancement within their industries.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there's so much more to talk about regarding involving all the workers in these low-wage industries, right? Because we cannot continue to think of the jobs. We cannot continue to talk about jobs. We cannot continue to talk about workforce development if we are not including our workers. And I think that investing in removing some of those barriers, because a lot of our members could not go to other worker, how can I say this, like other things that are not worker centers, right? They have a lot of barriers to start off, sometimes the language, sometimes the documentation that's needed, right? So I think even starting at that starting point of removing some of those barriers and really include the larger base of like where workers are gathering, it's a great place to start. Yes, I agree.
Can I add a comment, Najiba? I think I want to just like take a more bird's eye view too. I think what we've seen through our work is that and kind of the intention behind this brief too was to help to show that worker centers who are working directly with these workers and centering them in their efforts, that this approach to workforce development is different. It's not what has been supported and funded necessarily before by the workforce system. And so we were very intentional about like trying to really show what the approach looks like so that funders can see that they might need to design opportunities a little differently for organizations that have a different approach to workforce development. And so I just wanted to point that out because we've seen some new opportunities for engagement for worker centers in workforce development initiatives like HRTP in a limited way, the SEED initiative. we see it more now, but there's more work to be done to make sure that folks can effectively engage with the workforce system.
Great, and there's some really wonderful questions in the chat. And so I wanted to open up the door to have that conversation. And one thing I wanted to, there was a question about re-entry, legal aid at work and other organizations. Some leading in Oakland have been talking about ban the box in terms of re-entry and both for public as well as private employers. So that's certainly an area that could be explored more. Janelle or Flor, do you want to address, or does anyone else from our panel is there anything else that you wanted to, I'm going to go through the questions. Is there anything anyone else wants to add around re-entry?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, so we do partner with Legal Aid at Work for our legal clinic, and that legal clinic is a service that, we partner to provide to folks. And a lot of times what'll come up is we'll find that whereas one person in one workplace may have the issue, that means that many others, sorry, it's like cars, but many others in that same workplace may also be having that same issue. And so it's an opportunity for, again, workers to gather in number to take action on the issues. But yeah, going back to what you were saying about ban the box, I mean, that's an excellent example of what I was saying again about removing barriers. A lot of our folks who are returning, as they say, may have multiple barriers, like some as a result of that time, but other barriers as well. And so that's why it's so important to take that holistic approach and include folks as people, whole workers that no matter how many different issues running up against, still deserve to be included in what we're building here.
Something that I like to add, Jiva, is that look at the small investment that has come to workers and jobs. And even the most recent, thinking outside of the box a little bit, like even the SEED initiative and what that has resulted on. I mean, for us, it meant a worker cooperative, right? And so just thinking of how those smaller investment and really keeping us as part of those conversations make big changes, not only for a few workers, but for industries at large. So just thinking about that and the importance of having worker centers be a part of the larger scope of conversations around the workforce development funds. It's just that tiny how it can spark up so much more.
Absolutely. I think having workers at the table for allocations is really important, and a function of, we have, by the way, we have folks from all over the state and from out of state. Different regions have networks. Northern California is actually in conversation to thinking about organizing a network. So I just wanted to encourage you. We have a statewide coalition as well that was already talked about. So I wanted to take two questions together for our whole panel. The questions were around how do worker centers impact workforce players? What types of modalities of influence have you used? So that would be one, sort of related to a second question, which is how do you manage and engage programs that continue to use a deficit-based framing for training and approach to workers in low-wage industries? And so I think that would be just helpful if anyone wanted to address either of those.
Yeah, I can kick us off. And the first thing that comes to my mind is we don't open any programs or trainings that the workers are not requesting in the industries, because they're the experts. There's no point on putting any programs together without the need of having those programs. So the need for our detailed training, the need of our workers' rights campaign, the need of that comes from the workers themselves. They're involved in the process and in the outcome and in the training and then the trainers, right? So they are the experts on the topic. So when there's a need, the best way to approach it is through that very same becoming, each and every worker becoming its best advocate. So that's how I would respond to that. There's no trainings or anything happening at the worker center that is not really needed or requested from workers.
another way to push back when, engaging in a deficit-based model is really just to show up genuinely, and speak, with dignity and just show folks what is possible, because I think that folks have been engaging in some of the, and I like that you named it as deficit based, just really because it had to. It was a power thing. Like, that's where the money was at, that's where the resources are. But to say, okay, I can, be a part of this, but I don't have to use that language. And I don't have to set up my program the same way it's been set up. And I don't have to use the same partners that y'all been using, and I can include folks, that are, building this program totally different. And all of us are behind these workers. So all of us are, trying to, lend our support and figure this out in a way that makes sense for the community that our program is rooted in. And so, for example, we are part of the High Road Training Partnership program in the state. And, our stuff looks a little different, it's unique because it is worker led and because it is, in partnership with labor, and it's, for the first time engaged in the public sector too. So, with that, just like I said, showing up and, speaking of our work in a dignified manner, I think alone shifts it. Just, I saw someone put in the chat that the language was resonating, and even that language of low wage industry, not low wage worker, that is just a simple way to show up in the space. I'm not going to say that. I know that's what you wrote on the form. I'm not going to say that, and that's a really, like I said, it's, subtle, but, more dignified ways to engage.
Great. And I was going to take two questions and put them together. And I just wanted to emphasize one thing that we learned from this report and the research that the Labor Center has done, and our two presenters today, is that we also, as worker centers and people who engage with workers, many of our staff are former workers or continue to engage in those industries, that we really are gatekeepers to communities, and not to underestimate that asset that we bring to the table, and to represent and think about that ethically. I think that's really important. And more as diversity and inclusion find their way into the framing of whether it's public sector or private sector philanthropy, to walk into the room with an ownership of a legitimate collective representation of communities. And I think that's powerful. And I just wanted to put that out there, because it's, again, that language of marginalized communities assume that there's no power. And I think walking into the room, legitimizing ourselves first, and with the research and information that individuals and communities such as the ones we work with bring to the table, whether it's empirical evidence of their contribution economically to Los Angeles, or whatever community you work with, I think being armed with that, for lack of a better word. So there are two questions that we can put together. One of them is, how do you find funding for worker centers? What is the funding? How do you do, especially for advocacy and the kind of work that you do? And eliding with that question is, if I'm a worker center, or I work at a worker center, how do I build the capacity for workforce development? So maybe if those two questions could be taken together. I also wanted to direct people to the Irvine Foundation, which has established multiple programs now addressing, and here it's just to look at how they're doing that on workforce development and low wage industries. So I wanted to point out that locally that has been a big important focus. So I'll hand it over. And if anyone from the UCLA panel wants to add anything, feel free.
Well, that's a good question. Where y'all get your money from? The dream, is to be self-funded, right? That's the dream. The revolution will not be funded, right? Ideally, our movement would fund itself. The reality today is that we do get a lot of support from philanthropy. And so, when you choose, I find that when we choose who we are taking money from, it is a values decision. And we have to think about, what is the interest of the person who seeks to give us some dollars, and what do they think we're going to do for them? So those are the questions that are, really important on the front end to ask. And so, with, generous support from, like, the Irvine Foundation, we are able to engage a lot of these conversations in a dignified way and in a powerful way, because, we're joining conversations that impact the entire state of California. And so that's just, an example of, like I said, thinking about, being thoughtful, when you're building a budget. And then the other question What was the other question about workforce development?
Yeah, if you are, let's say you're working with a worker center, what are some of the resources if you wanted to grow in the area of workforce development? What are some of the resources or actions you've taken in your own center?
That's such a good question. So I feel that as folks at worker centers, it's our responsibility to define workforce development for ourselves. So I think that's really the first step. And so even just the term workforce development, given the history of work in this country, is so fraught, you know? And so I think it's really on us to at first just define that for ourselves before we determine how we want to engage in an inherently oppressive system. I'm talking about, our wonderful state of California came up with a program about economic resilience, and it's called SURF. Like, did they think that was funny? So these are the folks who we are engaging with. So we got to be real thoughtful before we come in the room about what we want to do and what we expect from that. So I think that's the first thing, is just, having that clarity. And then I think also moving with our allies, because like I said, we build power together, and these, the come ups that we have, like I said, we're only going to come up together. So I think that's super important. And also being thoughtful, if you choose to develop a curriculum, that is useful for y'all, that is also for y'all, and be thoughtful about who else that may or may not be for.
Wonderful. And I was going to point out that part of any public funding for wage theft or enforcement of labor practices should include as a best practice community contracts for co-enforcement, which study after study have shown make those much more effective. So in Los Angeles, as part of the budget, the allocation of funding for outreach and organizing, San Francisco is really a model in this type of work in terms of how they've set aside budget appropriations for community organizations to do that kind of not just outreach, but also organizing. So I just wanted to point that out, that in addition to getting wins on agencies, it's important to think about what they're funding and whether there is appropriate funding depending on the population and numbers in your city or your municipality or your state. I think, Flor, are you there? Or I think.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure if my Wi-Fi is not functioning as well, but I like to say that the way or where we get our funding from, we knock on many doors. And like Janelle said, being very thoughtful of what money we want to take and what really stands with our values is really important. I think that the way that we stay engaged and that we look for funding and that the way that we address the workforce development is creating that momentum, that inclusion. It has taken us years. Things like the study, things like how we show up every day, understanding and walking into spaces, knowing that we're doing the damn thing. Like we are walking the right path because it's coming from workers, for workers at the end of the day. I think CWAP and COVID has taught us to know that we are the bridge for our community, that we are who workers need to stay engaged, to stay committed. I think we are that bridge. And I think understanding that, knowing our worth and what we bring to the table, having that together with our allies, then creates a bigger movement. That's one of the reasons why we are doing this today, right? Why we will continue to do this, because maybe funders who haven't looked at us before would understand that now. I think if anything through COVID and then actually telling us to help distribute funds for the marginalized community. And though we saw it, Janelle, exactly, right? Like, how can we need something like this? But actually, we are the bridge and we are who is going to make that happen. Now, moving forward, you should consider us for this because there should be no other way. We are the bridge to that. We are the connection to those workers, to our communities. So yeah, I wanted to contribute.
Great. Well, thank you. There's some really important questions in the chat, and I know that we'll follow up on them. I think a question to kind of also close out is, what has been the reaction to this report by workforce development, whether it's agencies or organizations outside of the worker centers? And maybe as we turn it over to you, Ana Luz, you can address that. I think that's really important. This was a key part of 2 prongs of the LA Worker Center Network goal, which is to mainstream discourse on low-wage industries and workers, and to do public education that impacts policies, but also all of the various stakeholders that we've talked about. So we're so delighted to do this in partnership with everyone today, and we hope you'll join us on this journey, whether you're an employer, whether you're an advocate, wherever you are. We really think that there's room at this table. So I'll hand it over to Ana Luz.
Thank you so much. And surprisingly, folks are really open to hearing about what worker centers do, particularly in the California Workforce Development Board. They want to know how to reach the most marginalized workers in our states. And worker centers are proving that we can, and that you're doing this in a very effective way. So we're looking forward to more conversations. I know we're at time, so I'm hurrying up because I think it's gonna end. But thank you all so much for being here, and to our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And thank you all. We hope to continue to have these discussions and reimagine workforce development. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Take care.